Let's talk supply chain. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Let's Talk Supply Chain. So let's get you thinking with a question before we begin. Now, today's guest was recently named a leader in the 2024 Gartner Magic Quadrant for Warehouse Management Systems. But how many times have they been recognized by Gartner? Well, this brand is really making waves in the industry, so it's got to be a good number. What do you think? Let me know your guesses over on social. Keep listening because I'll let you know at the end of the show. So today I'm joined by an organization that connects over 2 billion people to over 20 billion consumer choices. They're passionate about building technology that moves life and commerce forward. And this is their third time on our show. And who is it? Well, it's Manhattan Associates. Now, Manhattan provides more than just supply chain solutions through advanced cloud native technology and a cutting edge vision for supply chain unification. Manhattan's team of experienced industry experts are dedicated to equipping their partners with the tools needed to navigate the supply chain commerce world effectively. And it's Mandar, Senior Director of Research and Development at Manhattan, that is joining me for the show today. Now, with extensive experience spanning sales and operations planning, procurement, manufacturing, logistics, operations finance, and ERP implementation, Mandar brings comprehensive perspective to supply chain innovation. And today we're going to be talking all about the power of unified supply chain planning. We're going to be discussing breaking down silos to build one cross-functional supply chain plan. And I'll be asking Mandar about the importance of UI design and leveraging AI and machine learning to reduce the complexity in planning. We'll also be exploring why everyone is talking about supply chain unification. So welcome to the show, Mandar.
Thank you, Sarah. Look forward to our discussion today, and thanks for the opportunity to have this conversation.
Yes, I'm excited to have you here. Now, we had Bryant Smith and Jeff Beadle from Manhattan on the show back in October. We talked about supply chain unification and forecasting, and they were both fascinating episodes. If anybody missed out on those, go and check them out. They were episode 430 and 432 because they really link to what we're talking about today. So I highly recommend you go and do that. And I'm looking forward to carrying on the conversation with you, Mandar, hearing your perspective, diving into even deeper into the world of Manhattan. So let's get started by having you introduce yourself. Tell us what you do at Manhattan. Give us a brief overview of Manhattan as well, just in case anybody missed our previous shows.
Absolutely. So, Manhattan has been a supply chain commerce leader for over 30 years now, and we provide end-to-end supply chain software solutions. So, if we follow a consumer and start from the store, so we provide solutions to manage the point of sale, store inventory, and then on the backside of the supply chain, manage warehouses and transportation. And with supply chain planning on the active platform now, which we will talk more about, it's a comprehensive supply chain solution provider. As far as my role, I lead the product design team for our planning solution,
Mhm.
and I've been with Manhattan for about 3 years. And as you mentioned before, I've spent the last 20 years or so in different parts of supply chain. So it's exciting to be here, and look forward to our conversation again.
Yeah, when I was going through the introduction and sort of really getting to understand that you've worked in almost every single aspect of supply chain, it really got me excited about the conversation today because it's not always that we have somebody with that much experience in different areas. So tell me a little bit about like that journey. What kept you in supply chain and being so passionate about it?
Yeah, it's very interesting. So one interesting tidbit about my career is I actually was an ex-Manhattan customer. So I
Oh,
used the planning solution tool, and and I have a ton of friends at Manhattan, having gone to Georgia Tech. In Atlanta, Manhattan is headquartered in Atlanta, so there is a lot of people who move from tech and go to Manhattan. And I never knew till I started using Manhattan's planning solution how powerful it was, and I was a big fan as soon as I started using. Now, as far as my career in supply chain, it's an interesting journey. So I'm a mechanical engineer undergrad, and
nice.
I started out my career in manufacturing. And the first lesson I learned on my day one on the shop floor is I know nothing. So as soon as so
Where we
that's
all start.
That's what we answered. But then, being a fresh grad, I thought I knew everything in the world. So started out in manufacturing, and then processes in general fascinate me. So because there is so much in a simple process that we think about. So process improvement was something I like doing. So that led me to come over to the US. I did my industrial engineering master's at Tech, and then since then, I've been in different manufacturing companies. Georgia Pacific started out in the planning department there and moved to logistics. So it's just been an organic growth, and as and how the opportunity presented. So the last decade, one of the decades in my career, I spent at a bedding manufacturing company, and I got an opportunity to go around the block, so to say, within supply chain. And procurement is a whole different world out there. So it's just been, I guess, partly I've been lucky, but it's been very an excellent learning experience. And every stage of the career, I thought I knew something. I was thrown into an area where I knew nothing, and that has been a very rewarding career, I would say. And where I'm right now is it's such a fascinating time to be at Manhattan and to develop a product to leverage all this experience that I've gathered. And again, this is the new area where I started knowing nothing. So it just keeps me engaged. Supply chain is never simple, even though it's common sense. It's the most uncommon common sense that we can come across.
Yes,
So
thank you for sharing your story. And you're still so passionate about supply chain. So we're doing something right. But learning that you were once a customer of
mhm.
Manhattan and you liked it so much that now you're working for Manhattan is really a very big deal because you've been there at different sort of stages of their journey with the technology and you're so passionate about it and really want to better understand it and understand how it can help customers. I think that's kind of the key when we're setting the tone for this conversation about where you're coming from in the journey and the perspective that you bring to the table. So I appreciate you for sharing that. Now today we're talking about unified supply chain planning. I feel like this is a real trend. I mean, in the second half of this year, I've had so many conversations more than ever before about unification and planning. Why do you think people are really starting to pay attention to unification? And why is it important to merge supply chain planning with execution?
Absolutely. So I think if we break down the reasons into two parts, one is technology. So we are at a time where the processing power is enormous, right? With everything being in the cloud, there is no limit to how much processing power we can invest into a process. Also, the amount of data that is available. I mean, we are all, providers of data to everything that needs data. So there is a tremendous amount of data. There is technology that supports harnessing that data, and we have, science and technology combined to have amazing AI ML algorithms to process and make sense of that data. So one part is technology. The second part is driven really by the complexity and ever-growing complexity of supply chain. So if we think of ourselves as consumers, maybe a couple of decades ago, if we wanted to shop something, we would go to the store, buy something, shop around a few stores. If we liked something, we got it. If not, we just walked away and came on another day to see what the assortment is like. And that's the speed at which business moved. And now, essentially, we have like thousands and millions of shops at our fingertips, and we can just keep browsing and buying. So the speed at which consumers expect service has tremendously grown. At the same time, the technology and the power to process this has tremendously grown. So it's the right intersection of requirement by us as customers and then technology that will support it.
Yeah.
So that's where we are, and that this is the right time to do it. As far as why merge planning and execution, and so that part, I would like to think, what if we don't merge planning and execution, right? What happens if that doesn't happen? So there is a tremendous amount of we are all now used to 2-hour deliveries, so it takes a lot of effort and cost
Maybe
to
not
make
for
it
us
happen.
in Canada, but in the US, everybody's used to 2-hour deliveries.
Yeah, I mean, but that is an expectation, right? I mean, it's not unheard of now. I mean,
True.
nobody blinks an eye when somebody says, I got 2 hours. I mean, I'll tell you a
Right.
funny anecdote. So my dad's in Mumbai, right? And
Mhm.
he purchased something on an online grocery store, expecting it to be delivered next day. And he just placed his order and started to walk out the door. And the guy came out to deliver him. And this was in half an hour. It's
Wow.
amazing what that happens. So he was blown away. And but that is what has happened is expectations have gone up. So if we don't merge planning and execution,
Mhm.
then it is compensated by having extra inventory. I mean, how do I make sure that people are satisfied is to add more inventory.
Yeah.
So it comes at a cost.
Well, and
So
that's why it's coming up a lot because I've had, and I don't mean to interrupt here, but I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of, retailers, organizations that do carry inventory. And one of the mandates that they've had for 2024 is to reduce that inventory and that capital overhead. And so it has been very top of mind. So that really makes a lot of sense.
right. So, and that's the downside of not unifying. I mean, what does unification get us is, and we'll talk more about it throughout, is passing information seamlessly, right?
Hmm.
So inventory is a big cost, and I read an article that said uh, the cost of returns is significantly high.
Hmm.
So the fulfillment of customers within really short and aggressive timelines, but then having too much inventory leads to cost, and having returns leads to a lot of cost. So
Hmm.
managing this messaging and information flow, the key goal or the key benefit I see is reduction in or right sizing the inventory, not having too much or not having too little. And
Yeah.
and there is also a lot of human stress involved in all of this, and to make this flow at this speed, because now the inventory just doesn't have to be at the DC or at the store; it has to be everywhere.
That's
Because
true.
right, we can decide to buy it online, pick up in store, or buy it online or get it delivered to home, or buy it online or get it delivered to a drop box near us, or I can go to the store and I can place an order to be dropped off at home. So there is a lot of complexity, and unifying is going to help position the inventory in the right place at the right time, to use a cliche, but that is truly the benefit, is unifying and having information available easily.
Yeah, well, and we kind of have to be everywhere for everyone, I think is probably the right saying in summarizing what you just said. And I thought, I'm sure there's a lot of people that would be glad to hear that things are changing. I mean, we talk about supply chain historically being so siloed. Why do you think that is? Why did we traditionally want everything to be so siloed? Because I hear a lot about warehousing versus transportation, for example. There's
Mm.
always the blame game sometimes, right? You've got sales and marketing versus operations. Why are we so siloed? Why do we sort of look at it like we're our own department that really has nothing to do with everybody else, when really we should be looking at it as unified, as collaborative, as bringing everybody together, because there's an impact on every decision that people make within those different departments, even if it's at the executive level. Like that makes an impact on the way down as well. So I think there's been a lot of silos. Do you think that people are happy? Like, why do you think that is? But do you think people are happy that now we're starting to think a little bit differently?
Yeah, I think silos, it's an evolution, right? I mean, us as humans can solve problems that are manageable.
Hmm.
We have to be able to get our head around to manage. So if I walk in a day and I have 10 different things to do, there is a limit to how many things I can do. So historically,
True.
we have had departments, right? There is a planning department, there is sales and marketing, and
Hmm.
obviously there are the execution departments, warehouse and transportation. Uh, Everybody chose to solve the problem that they can actually influence and manage.
That is such a good point. I've never really thought about it that way, but it's so true. You know, everybody is tasked. There's a lot of disruptions. There's a lot of things that we need to manage in our day to day, both professionally and personally. But you're right. We walk in with the intention of solving for those challenges and things that need our attention in that moment, and not really looking around to how it needs to be integrated.
Right. And I mean, if again, if I take a personal example, when we did not have the phones that we have,
Hmm.
it took us some time to write a letter. I mean, I don't even remember writing letters, but that was a way of communicating. And it took a while for the information to travel. And it took a while for people to take action on whatever information was shared with them. When I
Hmm.
remember, during one of my ERP implementations, I used to work with a person who had started working as a procurement manager in the year 1969.
Hmm.
He described to me, he actually had a typewritten PO on his bulletin board. And we were in this now day where we were implementing an ERP system. So he told me he used to have a team of typewriters or typists to create POs and mail them to the supplier. Uh,
Wow.
and so I asked him, so what did you do if you had to expedite something? So he said, yeah, he had to get a permission to make an across the state phone call and then do what is needed.
I remember that.
Right. So,
Yeah, you've just triggered a memory for me because if we needed to call long distance, we had to put in a code so that they could track who was actually calling long distance. Wow.
right. And so now if we put that as our reference, things obviously move at a much faster rate. I mean, nowadays we barely call each other, we text each other, or whatever it takes.
True.
So information is moving faster.
Mhm.
The amount of information we have at our fingertips has increased. So why silos is because that's the best speed at which we could operate at that time. So there's been an evolution into going from paper to on-premise systems to now having systems that have optimized and solved the problems within their silo.
Mhm.
And now we are at this juncture where the technology is obviously much faster, and now we need to catch up with it and see if we can solve the same problems differently. I mean, what
Mm.
application is really to try and solve the same problem differently in a more efficient way. I mean, we don't even think of writing letters anymore, obviously, right? Because we have a phone that we can use.
I mean,
Uh,
I do, but
and
I'm a
that
little
would be for
different.
sentimental reasons. There is more meaning to it, but
Mhm.
in general, I mean, that's where we are. But yeah, there is value in doing it the conventional way. At the same time, we are at this juncture where we need to unify it, and there are
Yeah,
reasons that I talked about. There is a cost of not doing it, and
right.
people have tried, right? So it's not that we are all as users and applications did not want to unify, but
Mhm.
again, the limitation was we could not because of whatever technology was available. So we ended up with integrations.
Mhm.
Integrations are just bolt-on things that we add on to each other, and then it becomes this unmanageable behemoth of system to manage.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
all those tech stacks that everybody's talking about right now. So
integrations that, yeah, go ahead.
no, I want to take that a little bit step further because we're talking about those silos. We're talking about why people have traditionally worked in silos, and it actually makes so much more sense to me now that we're having this conversation and sort of understanding where we've come from and the mindset around it, how we're thinking about it. And now we're getting into sort of breaking down those silos. What does that mean? How does it start? I think it starts with a plan, sort of like an all for one and one for all approach. And that movie is like 25 years ago. So pardon the reference. But talk to us about breaking down those silos. Like, how can we create a single plan to help break down those silos and maybe align all those resources that we're talking about to a common business objective? And how is Manhattan helping to do that?
Sure. So again, this is another generation of trying that. So the sales and operations planning process that many organizations use is that attempt, right? Is to have one plan that everybody in the company can agree upon, and everybody can march to the same tune. Except, just like integrations are not unification, S&OP has its benefits for sure, but it also has its challenges. So a typical sales and operations planning process would run throughout the month, that
Mhm.
it starts with an unconstrained demand plan. So the sales team is going to provide that input. Then it goes to a supply plan where the supply side of the house is going to look at the demand plan and say, this is what we can supply. Now there is a third step to look at both the data sets and say, okay, this is our constraint plan that we can actually work with. And then there is an executive step to it, say, okay, I need more people, I need to adjust capacity on and on to make that decision. So it's a 4 week process, or at
Right.
least step process. Now, we have tried doing that, and it takes a lot of data and a
Mhm.
lot of people to pull data from different applications to churn it and to make sense of it. One of the first lessons I learned as a forecast analyst is as soon as I send out or publish a forecast, I'm lying because it's no longer the right forecast because things have changed, right? But
Oh, to be a forecaster these days.
I did, and I think is there is a
Kind of
phrase
like
that
the weather people, right? I mean, we give them a hard time because they they tell us the weather and they might be right, they might be wrong.
right. So it's a difficult job, but that's the fact. The forecasts change every single moment as
Mhm.
something happens out there in the market. Uh, Prediction is difficult, especially about the future. I think that's something. Is it Yogi Berra or Niels Bohr or somebody had that statement?
We are coming out with all sorts of references. I love this, Mandar. I just have to point that out. Keep going.
Right. No, it's fun, but that's what it is. And so this process, the process is there, but the speed doesn't match the speed of business. So
Mm,
we now have to use technology to match that speed so that information is updated at the same time as it happens, and
mhm,
it's frictionless. So today, without these unification ability, uh, people are going to go through those steps, and information gets outdated, and also it has to be transformed for it to be meaningful to the receiving part of the next step in the process.
mhm.
So that's where some of the limitations are, as far as the S&OP process goes.
Well, and really, what you're talking about is really not that easy to do, right? To build a plan that works for everyone across departments, priorities. So, how do we simplify, right? Like I've always grown up with the analogy, the KISS principle, right? Keep it simple.
Yep.
And so how do we do that? Because I think that for us to move forward in a unified approach, I think we do need to keep it simple. I feel like a lot of supply chain professionals are very overwhelmed due to a variety of different things. There's lots of choices, there's lots of different things that we have to think about, disruptions. How can organizations simplify that planning process so that
Mhm.
it can be simple across the organization?
Right. So to me, it's about finding that common thread. I mean, so let's pick an example, right? So when sales or marketing is coming up with a plan, they usually have a financial goal, or they expect some amount of sales to happen, and there is a corresponding number of units that need to be sold. So that's the starting point, and that's, I think, the common thread throughout the process. So if I start there, and that gets to planning, planning does its analysis and puts it into a buying plan.
Mhm.
Now, when that goes to an execution system, that's where there has to be some translation. So, for example, when a warehouse management system or a labor management system looks at that same information, they are thinking of how many hours of labor I need to provide to support this volume. So that's the first, where translation needs to happen. How do I translate units to number of hours? And over a period of time, each, going back to the silo thing, every application has solved the problem. So the labor management system has a way of translating those units to hours.
Mhm.
Now, what doesn't happen is planning hands over the units and is expected somebody on the labor side to figure it out.
Right.
Figuring out has to be simplified.
Mhm.
Is And now if we add that onto Excel and different versions of Excel, and I don't know if you've seen this meme that says this is the final, and this is the final, and this is the final version. So
I
if
think
you
I have my own that says, "Are we on version 58?"
exactly. So if you now try to do this repetitively and do this transition and again, it becomes less efficient. To your point, how do we simplify this? Is to connect the dots and unify the data as it flows, right? The data shouldn't stop and flow, because with every stop, the data is less accurate and has to
Right.
be revised. So if we just let the data flow, if we let the units flow from the sales team and the pricing team onto planning and share that unit, and let the system do the translations along the way, and that makes it easier. So if I'm logging in my supply chain execution system and I
Mhm.
see the units automatically translated to hours for me, that makes more sense to me. Now I can make a decision.
You're translating it into the verbiage and the communication style of that particular department. So we
Correct.
don't necessarily all have to speak one language, which
Right.
has been traditionally one of the challenges, right? Because we communicate differently, we're talking about different things mean more to me than they do to the next person. And that's actually is going to solve a lot of challenges if we are doing it that way and people can see it in their own communication style, in their own language with what they need for their particular department. That's actually a really great way to do that. I love that.
Absolutely. And the message keeps changing because the business keeps changing.
It's
So if
true.
right today the challenge is in how efficiently and quickly can I translate from one way of looking at it to another.
Yeah.
And now add on the complexity of it takes a lot of effort to translate, and I'm just going to drop it, right?
Right.
And that's what happens, right? So execution teams, instead of trying to connect all the way to all the dots all the way up to sales,
Hmm.
they decide to do what is more pragmatic and look at, okay, let me look at what happened last year. So as we are
Right.
getting Thanksgiving now, everybody's planning for it, right? Everybody anticipates a peak, but what so I'm going to look at my last year and say, okay, it's going to be X% up or down, and that's my plan. But that doesn't necessarily connect all the way to sales. And that's the power of unification, is make the translation easier,
Hmm.
make it more efficient to translate as often as required so that nobody has to do it manually.
Yeah, because not only that, I mean, we have so many abbreviations in supply
Oh,
chain that sales is not going to understand. Neither is marketing, and they're going to look at it and be like, "What does this actually mean for me?" And then it translates it into their language, and they're like, "Oh, that's what that means, right?" The light bulbs are going off, and
yeah.
everybody's happy. I love that. So, when an organization has broken down the silos between systems, they're moving on to more of a difficult task of then analyzing and forecasting demand. How do they then leverage AI and machine learning to shift through all of that internal and external data sources that you're talking about, really to produce that more accurate demand forecast, which kind of what everybody is looking for at the moment, going back to what I said before, that reduction in inventory that a lot of those C-suite is looking for from our supply chain professionals and leaders.
Yeah, so forecasting is interesting, and obviously it's very powerful, right? And
Mhm.
as you mentioned at the beginning of the call, Jeff had a session on forecasting, especially. So it's definitely fascinating to listen to that. Uh, Forecasting accuracy is definitely a goal. Yeah, it should be accurate, right?
Mhm.
So now with the power that we have and the amount of data that we have, historically forecasts have always looked at history, right? Of the same item at this location, how
Right.
does it sell? What am I going to do?
As
That's the
long as
tradition.
there's no disruptions.
Of course,
Right?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. As long as there is no disruption, or once that disruption is there, it's almost amplified every single time I try to create forecasts using it.
True. True.
So now, yeah, I mean, I remember reading articles about right after the pandemic, all the retailers were overstocked on supplies because the
Mm,
demand just skyrocketed. And now that's what their forecasting model looks at and expects it to
mm,
happen again. And everybody has
right.
set their forecast at a high level, and then everybody has to either write it off. But that's the one of the downsides of just using only history. Now, obviously, people know about that and they adjust their models, but it's tricky. So to come to your point about external factors, I mean, the way I really think about it is it's about expanding the horizon of how far can I look. I mean, there are events happening that will eventually trickle down to change consumer behavior,
Okay.
right? So if I look at or three types of external factors. So there are the most common external factors that we think of is weather and economy. And
Yep.
I was listening to one of your earlier videos, which had econometrics. It was one of the most popular type of external factor. But that's the consumer confidence and
Hmm.
inflation, and those are very intuitive, but those are also very broad indicators.
Yeah.
So now to translate that to a specific, oh, what is going to happen to this particular item in my shop because consumer confidence went up or down? I mean, that's a very you know, difficult connection to make. So there are those type of external factors. Then there are external factors which are more industry specific. So I used to work, at an automotive OEM spare parts retailer and wholesaler. And having vehicle identification information is a very industry specific data. So if I need to decide
Right.
whether I'm going to stock a certain type of spark plug or a certain type of hubcap or what have you, there is that industry specific external factor that tells me, this model year Camrys or Civics or whatever the model be, and this is the population with this much of vehicle population. That is very relevant to me. Now that's a
Yeah.
bit closer to what I can do with that information.
Hmm.
Now the third external factor is, if you look at history for an item, and that's the direct connection, right? I sold it 2 years ago, I know how it sells. But there are also data points within the assortment. So if there are 10 different types of let's stick with the automotive example of spark plugs. And
Mm-hmm.
there is some similarity in them. So if I don't have type 1, I can use type 2. So there are halo or cannibalization effects are also important. So that's also closed. That's not truly external to the system I'm using, but it's
Mm-hmm.
external to the item I'm thinking about.
Right. And the various different uses, because they're usually made and produced for a specific use. But you're right, there's also a lot of
Mhm.
cross uses for some of those items that it can be used for if that other item is out of stock.
Correct, and similar in different industry, in the pharmaceutical industries, which is another set of industries that uses our planning solution. We all do this. I mean, if we go for a certain cough and cold medication, if that's not there, we're going to go substitute it with something else.
True.
So there are those, so to say, external factors or halo or cannibalization effects that are also important. So now coming back to the AI ML and processing power, more data is good, but it doesn't always lead to accurate forecasts. Meaning there could be
Interesting.
data that could disrupt my forecast and make it seem as if I'm going to sell more, but I'm not. So it's very important for the AI ML model to be aware of this fact and to reflect into the forecast calculation. So one of the common things we hear from our customers is yes, I want AI ML and I want the system to do everything, but I also want to control it. And that is
Okay.
important, right? So it's not just let the model do everything, even though there is a desire for it to do so. There
Mm-hmm.
is a tremendous amount of hesitation or rightful hesitation, I would say, to manage it.
Is it micromanaging though? I mean, we as human beings, we
Mm.
love to micromanage. I mean, there's some of us out there who don't. I really don't. But there's a lot of human beings on this planet who like to micromanage. Do you think it's because of that and we can kind of get in our own way a little bit?
I'm sure. I mean, there is comfort in being able to know I can control it, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So there is control. At the same time, there are some real dollars tied to decisions made, right? So if I just let the
True.
engine wild, it's going to come to a point where somebody has to explain why
Mhm.
I'm out of stock and why the customers are unhappy.
Mhm.
As on the other hand, the CFO is going to ask, why are we carrying so much inventory of this thing that is not selling?
Right.
So I think there is a fine balance, and you're right. There is that tendency of us as humans to control it,
Yeah,
right?
that's so true.
And there is
Now,
that, yeah.
I want to get to UI design. It's one of the things that I mentioned at the beginning of this show in the introduction, because it's not always something that immediately comes to mind when people are thinking about planning. It's certainly not something that I've spoken about with a guest on a show when talking about planning. But I think it goes back to keeping things simple. I think it goes back to helping with transparency. Can you talk to me about why UI design is so important in planning?
Absolutely. So as one of the ex users or end users of, I've used multiple planning systems, but one of the common challenges is planning has so many factors that go into it, right? When we start with forecast, then there are promotions that are planned, and then there are product introductions and phase outs. There are stock outs, and there is a whole bunch of things that goes into planning. And then to add on to that, when I'm placing a purchase order with my supplier, there are supplier minimums that have to be taken into account. So
True. Yeah.
at the end of the day, when a supply planner looks at the order that she or he is trying to approve, they need to understand what went into that order number that is shown to me by the system. That's
Okay.
where UI is very critical. I mean, there are so many layers to it. So one of the aspects that we really paid close attention to, and over the years has been a customer feedback, is it has to be simple. I don't want to go to 10 different screens to figure out why the system is ordering what it is ordering.
Right.
So that was one. The second thing is, given the complexity of the amount of math and science that go into these calculations, is transparency, right? I mean, the system does a whole bunch of things behind the scenes, but UI is the one that makes it simple for somebody to understand what are the different elements that go into it and what is the math that goes into it. Now, there is a balance to it, right? We don't want to overwhelm a user with too much information that they now are struggling to
Right.
figure out. At the same time, they need to know enough so that they can know whether it's right or wrong. So
So
what?
that they can be dangerous. No, but also going back to that transparency piece, that's
Mhm.
really crucial to trust. And going back to what you just said in the last part of this discussion around the fact that they have to take that data back to the rest of the organization, the executives, the C-suite, they need to be able to trust that data, trust that it's right, trust that they're bringing the right information forward. And I think that's where that transparency piece comes in. And like you said, if there's too much information and they're trying to navigate too much and it gets overwhelming and confusing, they're just going to try to do it on their own in a way that they understand and can then relay that information to somebody else.
Yeah, yeah. So interesting, trivia here, I guess. I mean, the world's most favorite enterprise application is. It's called.
Excel.
There you go. I mean, so I have an acronym for it.
Okay, what's your acronym?
One of my old, not old, but vendors in the past, software vendors in the past, introduced me to this term called EIEIO. He said, "This is the world's favorite system," and it really is, which stands for everything's in Excel and everything's in Outlook.
But then also, there's all of that knowledge. Sure, it's in Excel, but the person who designed it and understands the actual Excel, if they're
Mhm.
not at the company or anymore, the organization,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
lose it all.
it's gone. I mean,
Right.
it's all tribal
But
knowledge, and it's all.
EIEIO, that's so funny.
Yes. I mean, I love that acronym, but that's a fact. Excel runs the world to a large extent, and that's where UI comes into picture, right? To connect it back to
Yeah,
UI is Excel is favorite because it's easy, it's simple, and I can easily do things I want to do. So uh, that's where we went with fewer clicks, transparency, and easy to take actions.
I love
So
that.
that's the our UX team provide did a lot of uh, had a lot of input into it. So how do we make sure surface the
Mhm.
right information, have fewer clicks, so that it's easier for the user to relate to and take action. And
Yeah, I
that's
think that relatable piece is really important because there are some platforms out there that aren't easy to use, and especially for the next generation, if it's not easy for them to use and navigate and they can't get it like this, they almost don't want to use it and will go to something else. And you don't have a lot of time to grab somebody's attention. Now,
yeah.
I'm excited because we're almost at my favorite point of the discussion, which is going to be around examples and case studies and ROI and all of that. Before we do that, though, I've heard this term continuous order build. Can you just tell us really quickly what does that mean and why is it so important?
Sure. So, the conventional way of planning is there is a night job that brings
A
in
night
latest
job?
inventory positions. Huh?
A night job. You
Yeah,
mean we don't work enough during the day?
that's when the systems come to life. That's when
Got
our
it.
systems are supposed to work, right? I mean, and the key pieces to this night job are really bring in the latest inventory information and bring in uh, calculate the orders, right? So update your inventory, calculate the orders based on the latest inventory information, and generate orders for the execution team to act on. And that's kind
Mm.
of the gist of what that job that runs at night when everybody's sleeping. Now, the downside of that is one, everybody is I mean, I remember waking up to a 6 a.m. email that says, "Oh, something went wrong." And now
No.
my warehouse team is going to sit and wait for the orders to be generated. So that's one part of it. The second part is night job by definition takes a snapshot of inventory information, meaning, if something happens during the day, so let's say the night job runs, the order is created, and my planner is trying to review an order and approve, they are looking at a few hours old information. So in the world of omni-channel, commerce, things are happening right now. So let's say we have uh, a new product that's at the store. My night job said you have enough, so it says don't order anything. But it got sold because consumers walked in and they bought a bunch of it. So continuous order build really is the power of the platform, the active platform that we have, which as soon as somebody buys it at the store, that event is then that inventory change is communicated to the system, so the system is constantly updating orders. So now the information is not outdated, so it saves the hassle of or the stress of worrying whether the night job ran or not,
Yeah.
because we are now spreading the work throughout the day. And
Yeah.
then two, it's more accurate information, because if you now take that process further, if I miss that time window and the latest inventory information, I might be a week away from placing the next order with the supplier,
So true. So true.
right?
But also like understanding the cutoff times to be able to place those orders so that it can move quickly, whether that's, overseas and it's got to be moved by ocean freight, whether it needs to be put on a truck. And if people can know sooner, it just works out better for everybody because then everybody can compare for that or prepare for that.
Right.
So we're at the part where I'm going to ask you to share an example with us of how having a broad unified view and keeping everyone focused on a common business objective
Mhm.
benefits an organization's bottom line. That is top of mind for everybody right now.
Absolutely.
So talk to us about the example and what the key drivers of ROI for those customers were.
Yeah. So if I look at the total cost of goods sold for any customer, the biggest cost driver is the cost of inventory itself.
Mm,
So there is cost of inventory, there is a cost of labor to add value or to move the inventory around, and then there is the cost of warehousing and transportation.
hmm.
So the rough number in my mind is about 70% of the cost of goods sold is inventory,
Okay.
right? And as we touched upon earlier, is not having this unified data flow is compensated by having extra inventory in different places.
Hmm.
Right. So that's the biggest benefit we would see. So depending on where a particular organization is on their supply chain maturity curve. So if they're using Excel for planning, which I have no judgment against it, I have done it. But if that's where they are, then they have a benefit in implementing a system. If they already have a system, then there is a benefit in integrating or unifying. And
Hmm.
that's the next frontier, right? So with every step of evolution and maturity along the supply chain ecosystem, there
Hmm.
is a benefit, and it incrementally adds on to investment in inventory uh, and overstock or understock. So either lost sales or overstock, which means lost margins. And that's the biggest benefit any organization would see as they connect these different applications within supply chain.
Yeah. Well, and each of those that you're talking about, you said inventory is 70%. Each
Mm-hmm.
of those have a cost component, whether it's the labor, the warehousing, the
Absolutely.
transportation, all of that, that makes up sort of that last 30%. So inventory is a huge component of that. And you're right. If you can get it right in the fact that you're ordering at the right times in the right amounts to be able to sell so you don't have that overstock,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to be in a much better place for even making decisions around labor.
Yes.
And if you need an additional person to really help produce those orders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So it just impacts every single piece of that puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
And if everybody has that unified view that manages those different pieces, because remember, people are managing different things, right? Some people are managing inventory, some people are managing the labor piece, some people are managing the warehousing and the transportation. Maybe they're looking at robotics. How do we
Yep.
make that decision to make that investment if everything's tied up in inventory,
Yep.
right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's really the other aspect of this is, so from an ROI perspective, really unifying this buys time, because everybody needs time to make a decision. And today, what happens if you look at the execution systems are typically operating off of a list of orders in their pipeline, and
Hmm.
they may have orders for a week or 2 week, right? Typically, that's a very short horizon. But with everything unified now, planning typically has information about 52 weeks or more. Now, the power of providing that information or visibility without a lot of data transformation or reports directly to the execution system, it buys them more time to make decisions. So one example is if I'm planning for my holiday period and I see a spike, so I do know how I'm going to see a spike, but if I see how much of a spike in what areas of the warehouse, 3 months ahead of time, it gives everybody more time to decide whether they
Hmm.
should buy differently or whether they should
So,
plan for labor more. So it's really
so
giving
true.
more time. I mean, it's time is money, as it goes.
Time is money. And if we all have more time to be able to make better decisions, I think that's kind of what everybody wants, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, really quickly, the last question that I have for you is, we're heading into 2025, we're heading into a brand new year. Obviously, we can't really predict some of the challenges and trends. What is one thing that you would say to supply chain professionals, leaders thinking about supply chain planning, unification? What's the one thing that you want to leave them with from this discussion to maybe think about, take action on? What do you think?
Um, so one thing to take, so I'd be remiss if I don't mention Gen AI in our conversation. right? So Gen AI, I think we are just scratching the surface. And Manhattan Active platform has Gen AI, and we are starting to now leverage it to make the system more conversational. Instead of somebody trying to understand what the computer is doing, the computer is now going to tell the person in their language what it needs to be doing or what it
Right.
is. So Gen AI is definitely a thing to watch out for, and I think the infrastructure is ready. Is about finding the right applications and tools that will enable them to tap into or unlock the power of data that they already have. So one thing to watch out for is really how can I make Gen AI more practical? And I'll give you, and we as consumers are starting to see it, right? I mean, we open up Microsoft applications, and now we suddenly see, Copilot, and Google has Gemini, and on and on. But it's happening. My teenage son recently, we were chatting about working smart and not working hard, and he told me how he has been using uh, Gen AI to summarize long lectures. Now everything's a software, so it's about how can we use Gen AI and work differently, right? The technology has changed, our habits have changed as end consumers or customers. How do we reflect the same attitude in when we look at enterprise applications, right? If supply chain leaders ask that questions of the solutions that they're looking for, is they should be looking out for, is there Gen AI and what can it do for me?
Yeah. Yeah. And how can it make my life simpler? I just heard of one where it
Mhm.
takes those email threads and summarizes it for you. I
Yeah.
can't remember what it's called, but I need to go and look that up because I'll tell you, when you're in one of those email threads and you have not been able to check it all day long, I think it's something that almost every supply chain professional and leader absolutely needs. Well, for decades, the supply chain has been siloed, managing distribution in one place and transportation in another. Systems were disparate with no real collaboration between teams until now. Manhattan supply chain planning marks a new era in strategic enterprise planning, one unified solution that continuously optimizes inventory, orders, labor, distribution, and transportation to a single plan across your entire enterprise. Now, did you have a guess at today's big question? Well, at the top of the show, I asked you Manhattan was recently named a leader in the 2024 Gartner Magic Quadrant for warehouse management systems. But how many times have they been recognized by Gartner? Well, it's an incredible 16 times in a row. And what an impressive achievement. If you would like to hear more from us, head over to letstalksupplychain.com. And if you would like to hear more from Manhattan, make sure you visit their website. It is MANH.com. Massive thanks to the team at Manhattan for making this episode happen, and for Mandar for joining me today and sharing so many incredible insights. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's been a pleasure.